So I'll start with sort of some welcome and introduction stuff, and we'll kind of move from there. By now, all of you kind of figured out at least some aspects of logging on to the WebEx, and that's great. Appreciate it. When you come in, you'll notice you're probably muted. That's intentional. We are asking that you provide comments and questions to us through the Q&A chat function, or the Q&A function, which is shown here. And we'd like you to, if you do have a question or a comment, please highlight all panelists. That'll make sure that Jake, who's working behind the scenes, and some other folks who are working behind the scenes actually can relay those messages to us. The second thing, which I think you probably just want to be aware of, is you can change your view up here in the upper right. And where the active speaker and thumbnail view is generally our preferred one. You can see our smiling faces and at the same time see the presentation. So that's sort of a how do you use the environment, if you will, type of slide. So we'll move a little bit further from there and just kind of give you an overview of where we are. But we're going to be talking a little bit about the project itself, giving you an understanding about what we're here tonight to do. We're going to talk about lakefront partnership examples, particularly one of the examples we'll be talking about is EUCLID. We're going to be giving you an understanding of the regulatory framework and give you opportunities to have some questions for us or ask us some questions, and hopefully we'll have some answers. Then we're going to give you a little bit of homework, and that's due February 1st. It's 10 to 15 minutes. It's not overly complicated. It's not algebra or trig, so we're good there. But ultimately, the goal here is that we give you enough information to actually feel successful and prepared to answer the questions that are on the landowner survey. So that's really the goal for tonight.
And if I could just take a minute before we jump in too far, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. My name is Mary Serby. I'm the new Executive Director for the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission. First week on the job, and this is public meeting number 2, so we are really excited. Our meeting on Tuesday, we had great turnout as well, and so just wanted to thank Jason and his team for putting this together, and thank all of you for participating tonight.
Outstanding, Mary. Jim, you want to talk a little bit about the introduction here?
I will. I'm thrilled to be able to tell you that I get to explain your homework assignment. So I'm Jim Salter. I'm the Manager of Planning Services here at County Planning, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to talk to you about the Lakefront Property Owners Survey that I hope you've received in the mail by now in the form of a postcard. So with all of our work, with all the planning work, you're going to hear over and over, especially in this project, that we just can't do this project without you. So this is our first effort to get your input. So we want to hear your thoughts on lakefront public access and, as a lakefront property owner, how it directly affects you. So we mailed out postcards, over 3,800 of them across the county to lakefront property owners, and we're asking you just that. We sent them out to single-family homeowners, members of HOAs and condominium associations, and apartment building owners. And you'll see on this card that there's a link to the project webpage as well as a QR code, and those will take you right to the survey. Once you're there, where you see the little arrow on the slide that says enter your code, just enter that 8-digit code above your name and the address line, and that'll get you started. So as Jason said, we're going to keep this open till February 1st. It only takes 15 minutes to fill this out. So please do that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at County Planning. And so we can talk to you and get you involved in this vision. So with that vision in mind, we're going to show you a video put together by County Executive Arvin Budish to talk about his vision for the Cuyahoga County Lakefront.
Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about one of our region's most precious assets, our lake. I'm pretty sure you understand and recognize just how great our lake is because you own property on the shore. And I agree with you, it's a wonderful, one-of-a-kind feature, one that supports recreation, commerce, industry, and our overall environment. That's why one of the county's main strategic initiatives is our Lakefront Public Access Plan. My vision is a walking and biking path all along the lake, from one end of the lake to the other. In fact, I'd like to see it from one end of the state to the other. That'll transform our entire region. How can we do that? We need to make sure that our lake is healthy. We need to make sure that our shorelines are safe from the destructive forces of erosion. And where possible, we need to expand access to the lake. Now, I know that talk of access, particularly when you're a private property owner, can be a little alarming, but let me assure you, we're not planning to take anyone's private property. What we do want to do is engage in discussions and to give you a terrific example of where we have seen a large project along the lakeshore work to great advantage both for property owners and for the public. In exchange for your voluntary agreement to allow this path to go forward, the county would take on the responsibility of helping to stop erosion along the shores. This should be a huge win for property owners. We can make your shoreline safer, and we can help increase your property values for years to come. So I hope we can begin this conversation about the Lakefront Public Access Plan and how it relates to you. I know that the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission is working to gather your input, and I look forward to hearing the feedback from this meeting and others. Our lake, it's so amazing and so unique. Let's work together to keep it that way and to make it even better for all of us. Thank you.
So it's a big vision, and we have some really big goals that we want to talk to you about tonight. First of all, we want to address shoreline erosion and protect private property. We know that there are rapidly eroding trouble spots that affect you directly all across the lakefront. Secondly, we want to enhance the health and safety of the lake. And through that, we want to look at shoreline protection measures that can improve water quality, habitat, and public safety. Because we really want to leverage the lake as a county-wide asset, as a regional asset for everybody. And we can do that by creating a connected network of lakefront access and lakefront assets and access points. So through this, we can link existing city parks, Cleveland Metro Parks reservations, and public rights of way. And with all those in mind, we can explore opportunities to create public access points on private properties. There's a lot of planning going on county-wide across the region on the lakefront, and Patrick Hewitt will talk about that slide. Thank you.
Again, my name is Patrick Hewitt with the County Planning Commission, and really this plan is aiming to improve public access, as Jim said, along the entirety of the Cuyahoga County lakefront, specifically along the shoreline, including both public and, in some cases, private property, up to and including that first major street, usually Lake Avenue or Lakeshore Boulevard. There's three main topics of the plan. The first, of course, is public access, improving existing access points where needed, and expanding access points where possible. The second is talking about erosion and ecology and stormwater management. We know that high lake levels and climate change have taken a toll on the lakefront. So this plan aims to focus on areas where we can repair and buffer against erosion in exchange for public access and improved transportation. And the third then being multimodal transportation. So people on bike and on foot being able to get along the lakefront, specifically between public access points, but also on major streets where possible. And we're doing this in coordination and cooperation with our regional partners, including NOACA, the Regional Transportation Agency. While we're starting off looking at the entire lakefront, we're going to quickly try and narrow down to specific areas of opportunity for more in-depth study and even preliminary engineering. And these are going to be areas where there's interest from residents and property owners. Now, we're not the only plan that's happening along both our lakefront here in Cuyahoga County and in the region. There are a number of other plans that are happening at the same time. CHEERS, which is being undertaken by Cleveland Metro Parks, is a plan focused on the area where MLK meets the lakefront near Gordon Park. The Vision for the Valley planning project is being undertaken by the City of Cleveland and NOACA, where the Cuyahoga River meets the lakefront in and around the flats. The Cleveland Downtown TLCI, or Transportation for Livable Communities Initiative Plan, is looking at transportation to and through downtown Cleveland, including the areas of downtown Cleveland that touch the lake. And the Community Confluence Plan is being undertaken between Rocky River, Lakewood, and Cleveland Metro Parks at the area where the Rocky River meets the lake. This plan, the Cuyahoga County Lakefront Public Access Plan, is aiming to enhance and assist the existing planning processes so that we can have a coordinated and cohesive lakefront throughout the entire county. At the same time, NOACA is undertaking a regional lakefront TLCI that's looking at Lorain, Cuyahoga, and Lake counties for many similar topics, transportation especially, along the entire lake. And we're working closely together to make sure that these plans and processes are coordinated both within our county and throughout the region. And I will turn it over to Jason, who will introduce all of the team and get into some of the nuts and bolts.
Sure, thanks, Patrick. So there's a lot of people and a lot of hands and a lot of expertise that goes into this. When we start looking at ecology and we start looking at water quality and we start looking at issues of trails and mobility and access, there's a lot of different players. And some of those players are on the panel tonight and are able to talk with you and kind of answer some questions. And there's a lot of folks behind the scenes who are contributing to this in a variety of different ways. We've started this process a little bit, as I think we've alluded to, with some preliminary discussions, one of which actually happened Tuesday, a couple days ago, and that was really focused on having an east and a west property owner discussion. So we're talking about with west folks tonight. If you're an east folk person, that's great too. But really what we started doing was we started in November and December having stakeholder meetings with a variety of different groups and nonprofits, municipalities themselves, some development corporations, just folks who had plans or were thinking about various things from a regional perspective. And the goal was to get their perspectives and understanding, as well as get the county residents' perspectives and understanding. And that's really what's happening on the 28th of January, is to get the broader community engaged to talk about the lakefront where they enjoy accessing. But well, I guess both groups are important perspectives. What I think is really important is the group who's at the table right now. And I think Patrick or Jim, you spoke about it at the onset of this, is really that this project doesn't happen without you as lakefront property owners being willing to develop a public-private partnership with the county. And so we're running all this feedback and input that we've had, even at a preliminary stage and coming up at the end of the month, through the lens that you provide us through the survey to give us feedback so that you can direct and guide where we sort of think about looking for investment and developing those relationships. So it's kind of the overview of what we started on sort of the dialogue side. Well, there's been a lot of things started on the I guess, existing conditions and sort of the physical side of things, right? Looking at the coastal conditions, and you see a variety of different photos from places that you know or love or maybe aren't even aware of, over in Lakewood and Bay Village. You can see some of the images, and then sort of on the far east side, you see this sort of example. And this is not something that we're all unfamiliar with. We see that a lot. Well, shoreline stabilization and the condition of the shoreline is one piece of it. As I spoke about, it's talking about green infrastructure and stormwater. Where are there areas where we can link flooding and restoration with recreation and trails and shoreline protection? The more things we can bundle together, the better off we are from a funding standpoint, and the more we can accomplish by doing one or two big, bold moves. And so that's really what we've been doing, is having those initial dialogues and understanding some of those existing conditions. And so we had this great opportunity to tour the 30-mile shoreline and get a perspective on what's happening along it. It isn't as if this is done in a vacuum, and I think, Patrick, you spoke a fair bit about this, right? That this is a plan that involves a lot of different communities and a lot of different initiatives that are already underway, and you highlighted some of those, particularly in downtown Cleveland and the NOACA study, but there's even broader things that are happening that can be built upon. So whether it's on the Solstice Steps or on the two bottom images you're looking at sort of the Cahoon Creek area and Cahoon Park in Bay Village, and then you're looking at Rocky River and some of the investments that are going on there with the construction of the pier starting up just a month ago maybe. Those are all things that are happening, and those all create opportunities to leverage and build upon, and that's really important for us to acknowledge, is that these aren't done in a vacuum. Well, we've started some things, and we have a lengthy process sort of plan for this initial investment of time and effort. It's really the beginning of everything. So if I look at what it takes to build a project and actually have some improvement along the shoreline, it's years. So if I said today we had all the money, we had all the people who aligned, it's a couple years from now, because the reality is the permitting process, and we'll talk about that in a bit, itself can be a 12 to 14-month process. So we're really just looking at the beginning and trying to identify where there's opportunity to partner. knowing that ultimately that results in how we determine, or ultimately that results in us getting things built. So let's look at a little bit at more detail of what this initiative, the county's Lakefront Public Access Plan will produce, or what it kind of involves. The first task is really what we're here to do tonight, and continue that dialogue with lakefront property owners, and then at the end of the month talking with the community more wholly about their perspective on where are we interested in expanding public access. What places are most precious to us, and from the landowner's perspective, who's interested in partnering. Once we have sort of that understanding along with the physical conditions that we know of exist throughout the region, we can start exploring opportunities and alternatives and areas where there's quick, simple things that we can do to make an improvement that would change the condition for a lot of different folks. Improve access, for example, to just one park, change an intersection. Early win, simple stuff. But then we also want to look at things that are longer term solutions, and that might be based upon areas that are more remote, or maybe where we aren't immediately connected to parks that already exist. We want to look at both of those perspectives, because ultimately our goal is, as the county executive expressed, is to look at a plan that is across the entire 30-mile shoreline. And so that's really our strategy, is to look at something that's quick and simple, and then also something that's visionary. Ultimately through this process, though, what we're hoping to do is, as I think, Jim, you spoke about, is identify maybe 2 to 3, 4 different areas where there's some initial investment, because one of the big things, and we'll learn about this in EUCLID's case and general, is that if you don't show progress, if you don't show that you actually can build something, people believe it's a plan on a shelf, and that's not the intent. And so we're really focused on trying to move something forward very rapidly and show some initial improvement. And that's why we're having sort of 2 focus areas or 3 focus areas. So we'll touch on the Euclid model a little bit through the presentation. We have 2 wonderful people tonight with us to talk about it. One, Joe Martin's a resident who lives along Lakefront and been working on this project with us probably for a decade, and Allison Lucas Love, who's been with the city for quite some time and been leading it up from the city's perspective. This is a really interesting and great opportunity and model that highlights how it could work. It's not to say it'll be the same, and certainly the improvements and the solutions aren't going to be the same, but there are some pieces and parts of this that are very analogous to what could happen through the county's Lakefront Public Access Plan. Before we do that, I'm going to ask you to take a little quiz. So it's not, as I said, too complicated, but I'm going to ask you to either pick up your phone or if you're on a laptop or whatever you want, that's great. Pick up a phone, and I usually find it easiest to do the right side, which is the text voting. You can just type SG Chicago to 22333. And that'll say something, when you do that, it'll say something like, "You've now entered the poll." And I don't remember exact wording, but that's roughly what it says, right? If you're doing it by web, it will be a little bit different interface. You can just type in, if you want to do it by phone rather than text, you can type in polleverywhere.com/SG Chicago, or if you want to go to your laptop and enter polleverywhere.com and enter SG Chicago, you'll all get to the same thing. And for tonight, no different functionality. There are some different functionalities, but we're not going to use those tonight. So I'll give you a second more, but if you can just type that into whatever type of network-enabled device you have, that'd be great. And I'll ask you 3 simple questions. All right. I'm going to flip the slide and ask you the first question. Not a hard one, a yes, no answer. So, of the folks who are on the call, who knows or has been to the Euclid Lakefront project? Anybody not been there? I know Jake hasn't been, so he's got to at least answer the question honestly. Jim lives there, near there. Joe's right there. Oh. All right. This is different than on Tuesday night. We kind of had the inverse of this, which is interesting, and that's actually good. You get to ask a lot more questions because you probably don't have the background as much for folks who are in Euclid. It's dropping like crazy. All right, so Now I'm going to switch slides. You won't be able to respond to this one anymore. We're going to move to a different slide. 2 more questions. Pretty simple answers. I'll give you a little bit more time this next one because it's a little more reading, but we'll run through it. All right, which of the following are true? So just true statements. It took 5 months to secure state and federal permits and approvals. That's text A if you believe that. Lakefront residents provided the construction easements, also paid for the construction. There were 80 to 100 property owners who gave easements and agreements to the city, or were A and B only true? If you were here on Tuesday night, you know this is working much better than on Tuesday. I had a small issue. So far so good. All right. It actually took 14 months, and Allison will talk about that, to get the permits and approvals. It's the equivalent of one of the most complicated permitting processes in the Great Lakes. I can guarantee that. Nobody believed the residents paid for construction. A few people did. Joe didn't pay for construction. Joe gave us an easement, but Joe didn't pay for construction. Joe gave the thumbs up on that. That's good. And there were actually about 80 to 100 property owners who gave easements and agreements, and we'll talk about that. So that's true. The last one. Which of the following are true as well? Lakefront residents were required to give up their shoreline. A. Private access is restricted due to public access. B. Federal, state, and county grants were used to construct the lakefront project in Euclid. Or all of the above, which is A, B, and C. I have to actually ask Jake later which one you actually answered with last Tuesday. Okay. Lakefront residents were not required to give up their shoreline. They actually willingly did it. Crazy as that sounds, Joe's not crazy. He had very good reason for it. I can't actually say that. I don't know. He might be. I love you, Joe. Anyway, so private access is restricted due to public access. It's actually not. We actually have a couple instances where we actually have public access and private access jointly, and I also will talk about that. And then state and federal grants certainly were used, and that's a result of thinking comprehensively and being able to link recreation, restoration, ecology, all those pieces and parts together. That becomes much more fundable. So with that, Allison, why don't you give us a little bit of history? And I know you and Joe have kind of been talking about this for a long time.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm pretty impressed by the poll results, knowing that, 70% have not visited the Euclid site. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone here this evening and hope to welcome you to the city of Euclid soon. My name is Allison Lucasy-Love, and I'm currently the acting director of our Department of Planning and Development at the City of Euclid. And in a few slides, I'll be joined by Joe Martin, who you have heard made reference to. He is a lakefront property owner, private property owner in the Euclid Waterfront Improvement Plan area. Has also been the president of the Beach Club Association that was involved in getting over an easement agreement. So for those of you who have not visited, have no idea where we're talking about, if you jump on I-90, head east, get off at East 22nd Street and head north, Sims Park is now a 40-acre lakefront park. It is our lakefront gem, and this project extends just east of that. So the Euclid Waterfront Improvement Plan, in our eyes, is an innovative shoreline stabilization project that expands public access across what is historically privatized land and remains privatized land, as we'll talk about. It's by and large, and as you can see on the slide, it's not city ownership, it's easement agreements, long-term 50-year easement agreements. Along Lake Erie, which we consider to be our region's greatest natural resource, and certainly is in Euclid, where we're blessed to have 4 miles of shoreline. However, a large majority of that, not unique to any of our communities here in Northeast Ohio, but a large majority of that is, of course, privatized and largely by residential single-family homes and apartment ownership. So this project connects residents directly to the lake, and like has been said, it's not just about public access, but about improving that near-shore habitat and mitigating erosion, which is really the win-win here that the property owners saw back in 2008 and 9 when the city of Euclid first engaged with Smith Group and first officially adopted this plan into our city council. What the project is a 3/4 mile trail. Thanks for advancing that slide, Jason. It's a 3/4 mile trail that will be finished by the end of 2021. There is a portion right now that you can come and walk on. But it connects that existing lakefront park, Sims Park, has the Hen Mansion, a new pier that was built as part of this overall improvement plan, and connects that to a new lakefront park at the far eastern end of the site that you'll see in a few images. It is, like I said, only 6% of the shoreline was accessible to the public prior to this project. Once it's complete, we'll have over 25% of our shoreline open to the public, and hopefully with this county project, we'll keep increasing that percentage. Prior to the project starting, there was just one community beach, which represented one public access point to Lake Erie. This represents, depending on who you ask, 20 years to 200 years of waterfront planning, right? There has always been a desire to touch the lake. And for many of our residents, even those who lived along the lake, they, for some of our residents didn't even have a view of the water. There was just a very densely vegetated bluff line, certainly didn't have direct access to it. So for those private residents living along this new 3/4 mile stretch, they now have direct access, so not only public access, but their own private access, which didn't exist before. And then the downtown reinvestment, economic development was certainly not only a catalyst for this project, but something that we know is going to continue to happen with increase in individual property values, but also property values throughout the region. Go to the next slide, Jason. And before we get into too much more detail about what the improvements were, I do want to turn it over to Joe, and he can talk a little bit about his observation of the shoreline before the project, and then, of course, since the improvements began construction back in 2018. So, Joe?
I'm a resident of Lake Edge Drive and was also the president of Lake Edge Beach Association, where we have 26 members on our street here. On this slide here, you can see a 20-year period, roughly 1949 to 69, where, up on the top with the red line represents how much beach was there in 49. You can see how it's receded down to the yellow line in 69. Probably 10 years ago, we met Jason with JJR, and we began talking like we're all talking today. We knew nothing about this lakefront development, any of it. We all walked in blind. And when we started, it was really a public access project more than it was an erosion project. But as time went on, obviously things started eroding even more. And it became apparent that this was probably a good idea for all of us. With our street association here, we had, at the beginning, a lot of people were against it. And then there were two holdouts that pretty much were against it when we were ready to start digging. And as recently as 2 months ago, one of them came up to me and said, Joe, you know what? You were right. This is the right thing to do. And they use the path every day. It's just an awesome thing. But what you see here on this slide, that's our association staircase on the right. You see that white gate? That's our approach from the end of our street. And then you can see the erosion conditions that existed prior to the construction. And again, that was kind of the impetus behind, it shifted a little bit for public access, more toward erosion control. Hit the next slide, Jason. Again, here's another picture and a sketch of the conditions that existed before the construction, and you'll see in a slide later what exists after. And again, at the very beginning of the conversations that we had with the city and with JJR, everybody was nervous about, we're going to lose our land, we're going to lose our property, are they going to take it over, and all that. None of that has been the case. This whole project has never been the spirit of we're going to take your land. There's been ton of meetings, consensus building, tons of communication. Never once, I can say as the association president or a homeowner, did I ever feel like someone was dictating to me what was going to be done. It was all a plan that was meshed together by everybody.
Joe, I was gonna give you a bad time earlier and just point out the floating
barrels.
Island barrels that we've had there for a decade. And this was your association sort of staircase and pad. And I guess I'm just pointing that out because we'll talk about their Allison will talk about that in a minute. And so they had access, not the best, and certainly some floating little hazards there, but just pointing that out because I think that
when we moved in 20 years ago, that pad was there. They redid the street, and we paid to have a new pad put in. But you could also walk along the beach. For the last, 5 to 10 years, there was no walking. There was sitting on the pad, and that's where you were limited. And that's another thing that's important down the road when you see how the area is improved now. Not only do you have erosion control and public access, you can actually use the property. You can walk on this beautiful path. We walk on it every day. There's tons of people on it, mainly for just quiet enjoyment. So you go to the next slide, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. I'll take it from here. So, lots of project drivers, very similar to the county's project. And the goals, right, for economic development, public access, and the erosion control. That if you're a lakefront property owner, as all of you on this call are, you're very familiar with the impacts of erosion. One of the things that has been challenging about the project from, the longevity standpoint, like Jason pointed out, it took us 14 months to get permits from state and federal regulatory agencies because of the length of this project. And on the bottom image is a render. At the top image is an actual ortho photo of the different sections. This entire project is nearly 3,000 linear feet. So it is the longest project that has been permitted by ODNR on the Great Lakes, on the Ohio shores, and to this day. So hopefully we'll start to see projects of the same magnitude because of the county's vision, and we'll continue to do this in such a way. And the thing that was, I think, probably most remarkable to the state about this is that they get permits every day. And some of you on this call may be familiar with the temporary shore structure permit. Perhaps you've gone and applied for a full shore structure permit for private improvement. And you see those on 70, 100, linear feet of land. And maybe it works for you for a period of time, but if your neighbor to the east or west doesn't do anything, then your property is just as at risk for that erosion continuing to happen. And what you can see on the top image here, there's a red line in 2 areas. Those are considered coastal erosion areas, and that's where we were losing in this project area 13 inches or more a year. And as the intensity of the storms and the frequency of the storms increase and the water level continues to reach a new high in the summer, every year, a new peak record high, the loss of that land was only becoming more of an issue, and not just for those property owners, but for property owners like Joe, who's just outside of that red area, but was definitely experiencing that continued loss. So, you can go to the next slide, Jason. One of the things that we were able to do as a city, because we had to study this 3,000 linear feet of shoreline, and because it was already an uphill battle to get the permits, sort of setting this precedent for the scale of the project, is we modeled the project in a wave tank in Canada, because there was not a resource available in the United States, unfortunately, back in 2015. And we modeled to scale the way that the shore or the wave action was going to impact these improvements decided, and there's, all these technical terms of tombolos and breakwaters, and, just decided, how the engineering was actually going to happen. And we were able to demonstrate to the regulatory authorities that this really can work, because they were used to seeing what a lot of us have put in as lakefront property owners, our own individual projects. And so I think that's just another thing to be thinking about as a lakefront property owner when you're thinking about what are the benefits to me of participating in a project that's at the scale that includes public access, but that includes a shoreline stabilization project of a significant size. The professional engineering and like the modeling is just something you'd never get on your own. It would never be cost competitive. So EUCLID is thrilled to be the model. We're thrilled to be here tonight speaking about it and continuing to give awareness to what we have been doing. There have been a few articles, not only at a regional scale, but at a national scale, such as here in this Next City article that was done a few years ago. And Joe is one of those 100 homeowners who may have changed the Great Lakes forever, and we'd like to think so. One of the other benefits of participating in a project like this is that you will be able to tap into funding that you have no other way to tap into. So I think that answer was, that question was answered correctly by the majority of people here, but the city of Euclid has been able to tap into over $14 million thus far of federal, state, and county funds, and that doesn't include some local money that was put up by the city directly. But, those are funds that are just not available to an individual private property owner on a sort of, ad hoc basis. And from the sustainability standpoint, when you talk about ecological health and trying to build a natural shoreline, again, not something you can do just in a short distance, and really something that we're very proud to have installed here in Euclid. And I think on the next slide, there's a little bit more evidence of some of the natural features that we've been able to incorporate, some biofiltration areas, native vegetation across the bluff where, again, before it was eroding bluff. So nutrients were, overloading the lake. And we all know that the health of the lake as our drinking water source is very important. I will let Joe talk about this. This is a slide that I think speaks really well to the definition of private versus public space throughout the project area. So, Joe, if you want to spend a minute on this.
Yeah, as I said before, we had countless meetings with the city and JJR, the developer. And again, you saw in previous slides that our street association had a pad on the lake. And part of what we wanted was to be made whole again and have our own pad. So what you see in this slide here is now we have a pad mid-bluff. With that, actually, it's more accessible as people get older, which is nice. But through the whole process, we came up with a six-page memorandum of understanding where the wishes of our association and our private wishes, my wife and I, were all detailed. And it's a legal document that says, hey, this is what we're doing in the project. Here's the scope of it. Concerns about, are we going to get our pad back? Concerns about lighting. No one wanted high lights because it ruins the sunset and whatnot. What about the public coming up? Well, you can see in this picture, first of all, the improvement's incredible if you remember what the erosion looked like before. But on the left here, you can see that's a locked gate that only our association has access to. We have an elevated pad, which is awesome. And then you can see, like in the lower left corner, there's low lighting. It lights the path, but doesn't destroy the scenery. And like I said the other night, words can't speak at how open lines of communication through this entire project. It really made it something worthwhile. We just never had any issues with it. And when you look at the entire benefit of public access, the whole city gets to use it. It's not a disturbance to us. It's just an awesome project.
So, Joe, I added this in here because when the pictures were taken, and we're still working on it because maybe in spring we'll have some better growth of vegetation, but this sort of indicates the two images on the right, some of the bluff stabilization projects we've done that sort of have a similar landscape character in terms of a native bluff character. And I think that was one of the questions I think we got on Tuesday was sort of what's that bluff supposed to look like, and how do you make it something that people don't want to walk up and that type of thing.
Yeah, we've had, during the construction process, we had a little bit of that because people were curious. I mean, that whole area was not walkable, and all of a sudden it was. So we'd have people climbing up the bluff or doing whatever. But since it's been completed, there's very little. There's been signage put up. You know, the areas with steps are lock gates. We just honestly don't have any issues. Is there more noise? You'll hear people talking, which we haven't been used to for 20 years, but it's been, it's just been great because one of the concerns was we're going to get all kinds of trouble and crime. Well, crime doesn't happen in populated places, and that's borne out here. I mean, it's the trail is used by people for lake enjoyment and fitness, and it's just a positive thing. And then it's not to say in the beginning, the very beginning steps, people were very, negative about it and didn't want to give anything up. But in the end, I mean, our impression was a good idea.
Thanks, guys. That gives a good overview, and we can certainly have you guys answer some of the questions if they do come in. I think that experience of actually going through that, working with the residents, was really important, and it's a process. It's not a one dialogue and then we're done type of thing. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're really at this beginning phase, this orange box, and permitting itself is a process that's 14 months. And through this, I don't know, countless is not exactly the right word. It's probably 20 or so meetings where we sat around a table talking about specific concerns about lighting and landscape, and I have this association, this, and what kind of railing and that type of stuff. It's good stuff, and it's important to have those dialogues because ultimately it's something that we live for an extended period of time. It's a built improvement, but it does take time to get there. Part of that process, as we spoke about, and Allison, I think you talked about, was 14 months of permitting, and the physical model took about 2.5 months. Maybe 3, but the permitting took us 14, and it's really because of the importance and the value of the Great Lakes and Lake Erie particularly. It's a drinking water source that's so heavily regulated, and there's a lot of different permits, everything from looking at historic preservation types of issues to sort of will the structures that we design and engineer actually stand up to the conditions, and then there's some leasing discussions that I'll explain in a little bit. We'll get into the dictionary, and this is I joke about this because it's one of the things that I've talked about from the very onset of my work is sort of who controls what and why do I care? And if any of you have been involved in permitting for your individual parcel, you probably have some understanding of this, but there's 2 regulatory lines that are important for our purposes. The first is a federal one. And that's the ordinary high water mark. It's basically the line at which you can see the wave action continuously hits and that area is constantly changing. And then there's sort of stuff that doesn't change. That's sort of this line. It's basically an elevation that is set by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's 573 or 573.4 IGLD, International Great Lakes Datum 85. And they set an elevation. They say, where does that elevation hit the land? And that is the ordinary high water mark. That's interesting and useful because it provides some context for regulations, but what's probably more interesting and useful is actually the state and how they actually have legislated this after a variety of different lawsuits and cases that have worked out in public. Basically, they have what's called the natural shoreline, and that natural shoreline is basically if humankind had not intervened because this bluff is naturally eroding, where would it have been in 1989? There's reasons for why 1989 is important, but ultimately that's the big concept is that where is it in 1989? And that is the defining line between public ownership and public trust, private ownership and public trust, where that defining line is. And that's really dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and it's not the most easy thing to actually look at because you have to go back in history and look at have there been any changes that have modified the shoreline over time. Again, why am I even talking about this? Well, we'll explain that a little bit, but I want to give you the context of EUCLID. And I think as Joe, you spoke about, and Allison, you spoke about, there were some really critical things that we were trying to achieve. Stabilizing the bluff, yes, providing public access, creating some habitat. Cobble beaches were a must from EPA's standpoint versus sandy beaches. They didn't particularly care for sandy beaches. They want creatures and critters. That's what they're looking for from a habitat standpoint. But one of the big things that I think Joe and a lot of his constituents were concerned about was where does the top of the bluff stand today versus where will it be tomorrow? Because I got a backyard and I got grandkids and I've got play equipment and all this other stuff, right? That happens at the top of a bluff, or my house might be right there. Well, through the easements and agreements and the negotiations, we ended up setting for Euclid that the existing top of bluff in this zone had to be retained. Couldn't move it back. So I ended up we needed to put a few walls in through this area. Further back on that slope, and the adjacent landowner said, yeah, go ahead, lay it back. We're losing our bluff anyway, and frankly, we like that approach anyway. And ultimately, the city ends up acquiring that as an expansion of Sims Park, but it's not as if there's not flexibility in how you do this. And so that's part of this, is understanding who are the individuals who are interested in a public-private partnership so that we can actually have more focused discussions. So as we spoke about, Joe says, and his group says, keep that bluff here. This guy says, pull it back. Perfectly fine. This line was defined prior to the conditions or the built project being built, the ordinary high water mark. It's basically the elevation where the grade of the land enters the lake. This is the other line, which is the natural shoreline. That's had humankind not intervened. This is where the property boundary, or this is where the shoreline would have eroded to. And so what they're saying is that even though my plat map, or I might look and I purchased my property and my property says Joe's property goes all the way out to here, Joe's property doesn't really go all the way out there because it's submerged. And if I want to walk on the beach or walk in the water in the nearshore environment, I can, because it's public waters. So the reality is his property line essentially ends at the red line. Both that red and the blue line, though, create really important boundaries, because there are only certain types of improvements that can occur lakeward of those two lines. So you'll see here the revetments lakeward of the natural shoreline, because that's allowable based upon DNR. Over here, the revetment had to follow the ordinary high water mark, because at the end of the day, whichever one of those two lines is closer to shore, that's the point at which we can start putting our coastal structures. We can't put them further out without some significant reason to do so. So what does that all mean? Well, it really is somewhat simple when you start to think about the easements and agreements, and that when you check the box of yes or maybe, I might be interested in a public-private partnership, what you're really saying is, we may be willing to give some sort of easement, and that these are two types of easements that would perhaps be something that you'd have to be allowing in the future. First one is an upland easement. So as we talked about, this red line defines public versus private ownership of property. We, in this case, wanted an easement to the top of the bluff, because if the city wants to put that in and maintain it, they need the ability to maintain that and make sure that it actually is a healthy landscape and that it's cared for appropriately, so we don't have erosion long term. So that's a benefit from a resident standpoint, and it's also a benefit from the city standpoint. But then everything lakeward of that line is actually a submerged land lease, and it's a three-party agreement that includes landowners, the city, and the state in this instance, whereas this one is just city and landowner. The reason this is, again, is because this is considered public waters. So we have the right to use it by permit with Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So I joke about the fact that this process is not a sprint, it's actually a marathon. And so we're gonna obviously have a lot of different touch points coming up. And as we spoke about, it's really tonight's about identifying where people are most interested in perhaps collaborating, where there's a public-private partnership. We're going to explore some alternatives based upon the feedback you give us, and then we're going to look at creating a strategy that is 30 miles long, but really focused on advancing 2 to 4 different areas at the onset of this, so that we can get some projects built and actually have some benefit to show that it exemplifies something that Euclid has already started to achieve. Again, that whole process, though, is not tomorrow. So while this winter is going to be high water and it's still going to be a little bit rough, we've got a couple more years before we can actually affect change and put projects in, and get things built. So I think Jim, you spoke at the onset and sort of summarized the county executive's goals of protecting private property and leveraging the county, the lakefront as a countywide asset. Those are all really important goals. I look at it a little bit different on the consulting side and engineering and design side of things as like, I think what Allison, you spoke about. It's not, and Joe can't affect change on, or he can affect change on his property, but the reality is what happens on his adjacent neighbor's property is equally important, because waves don't come directly at Joe's property. They actually come from the east and the west too. So addressing this not by on a parcel by parcel scale, but addressing coastal erosion at scale, addressing it so that we all collectively benefit and have a real solution that will stand the test of time. We want to link all those various benefits of restoration, recreation, mobility, and ecology, because that gets us the money that Allison, you spoke about, the importance of that normally public, private landowners don't even have access to because of the approach we're taking. We do. We want to respect private property owner property rights and your interests. If you're not interested in participating, that's great. That's your decision. And that's really the end of that. But we do actually see a lot of value, and from a regulatory standpoint, they also see a tremendous amount of value, because individuals, like I said, individual solutions, individual projects take a long time to review. They still don't always solve the issues. So I think with that, Jim, do you want to close us out on a couple of slides?
Love the presentation. So again, just a reminder, if you haven't taken the survey yet, please do so, and remind your lakefront property owner neighbors to do the same. We've gotten a good number of responses so far, and that number is just inching up day by day. So keep them coming in.
Outstanding. If you have questions, I think, Jim, you addressed this at the onset. Jim, you've been getting questions already, haven't you? So you can go to the website, county's website, and you can actually type them in. And some people after Tuesdays actually said they'd like to change their perspective on things and change what their response was. Or I think a couple of folks were having problems actually even getting the card or making sure that they had cards, right?
Right. We're getting 5 or 6 questions a day. They're great questions, and we answer them as soon as we can. And it's, with every answer, we're directing people back to the project webpage. So it's countyplanning.us. You'll see the Lakefront Public Access Plan, and we're updating that every day with new information. And by this time next week, we'll have videos of this presentation posted, along with new project materials as we get them.
I think you touched on it. There's a pretty large frequently asked questions section on there, which will be expanding, I think.
With pleasure, yeah.
It does. It's good. So that Jim and I generally, with a few other folks, contribute heavily to those FAQs. So with that, I think we'll open it up to sort of the Q&A session. And Jake, I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm going to be calling on you in a second. But as we spoke about, you can get to that Q&A and just look for all panelists if you could, and send those to all panelists. And we've been responding to a couple, I think, as we've been going through the process. I've seen a couple of responses go back and forth. But Jake, are you seeing some general themes, or is anyone seeing some general themes that sort of help us understand what people are interested in talking more about?
Couple questions that have come in. In the shoreline diagram specifically, we commented out there were several red zones, particularly in the Lakewood area. If the permits and agreements are in place, are there certain priority areas that will get attention first?
I think, yeah, we talked about this, and I guess I can let the county folks talk a little bit about it too. But I think ultimately the goal is to identify where there's interest, and if there's interest in an area that's not identified on those exhibits, I think that's perfectly fine. But I think ultimately our goal is to find where there's partners who are interested. I don't know, Jim or Mary or Patrick, any thoughts on that?
Spoke to earlier, this is really about creating effective linkages. So if there's interest in an area that's close to an existing city park or a metro park reservation, with a possible link to an area that could be developed, that's where we're going to be able to put more effort in instead of just, throwing a dart at the map and saying, here's a good spot. No, we want it to be effective and we want it to make sense.
Yeah, and I think it's something that came up on Tuesday, which, I have the benefit of I grew up in Euclid and I live in Lakewood now, so I'm on both sides of this lake. But I think the elevations and the geology, there's a lot of differences between the east side and the west side, and so all of those will be evaluated as we look at options. And I think it's been said before, but all of you who are on this phone and your friends and your neighbors who may not be on this, make sure that we're getting input from you, because this is vital to the, success of this project. And so we want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to provide input. And I know that the U.S. mail has been slow, and so a lot of people are delayed in getting postcards. So again, if you go to that website, you'll be able to still get all the information and fill out a survey. So we appreciate you guys participating in this.
And as we talked about, this information we posted on the website, and the video of this will be up for that. Jake, are there other questions? I think I'm seeing a lot of questions about Lakewood, and I'll generally group those, and I'm going to ask Jake if there's any other ones after that. But I'll generally group it with, I can't answer specific questions because I don't know the exact specific geography yet, but in general, we would be having a specific discussion with residents in that stretch. As to, those priority areas that were identified, yeah, I'm not particularly concerned about whether they were identified on a map and an initial idea or not. I think it's really driven by what we're getting feedback from in terms of owner receptivity is going to drive a lot of that. And then I think there was a lot of discussion, and I think, Mary, you spoke about it. Just in general, there's a difference between the east side and the west side. And one's more sandy clay and one's more shale and stone-ish, albeit neither one is really actually exactly stable without some tow protection. We've been looking at Bay Village and Rocky River and doing our geotechnical look at that. In general, those areas would probably be limited in layback. So I think one of the questions was, well, how do you do it when you have a house close or a building or structure close to the shoreline? You take a different attitude than pulling the bluff back. So I think it's just a different solution through those zones. So what exactly the solution is, something to be determined. Do you have a just tow protection with a trail that goes out in the lake some other way, or beaches, or what could you create? There's a couple different, there's a lot of different options. So those are all discussions about that would move forward on this. I think, Joe, one of the things we talked about at the onset was somebody didn't want people sunbathing in front of their property. So the cobble beach was a benefit to them because they didn't want people lingering on it anyway. So I think, what's the right solution? Joe's going to dictate what the right solution is. Like, you're going to do the same thing, right?
The big concerns for us personally in our home and the homeowners association is we didn't want to see people's heads, walking below our bluff. We didn't want to see people suntanning, and everybody listened to that. We don't see that today. We look out, we have an open view of the lake we didn't have an open view before. And it's really non-intrusive. And it comes from, like we keep talking about, it's the communication and the consensus building on how this thing's going to be done. So,
Jake, what else you got that you can kind of direct me to? I'm trying to sort through things here.
Sure. A question that I've seen a couple times is, what if people, and this was a question that was asked on Tuesday as well, if people have already invested their own, private money into shoreline protection and erosion control, is there any way to sort of get reimbursed on that, or anything that, getting reimbursed for those investments, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll give you the same ish answer as I gave on Tuesday. I think I don't know how it's constructed, so that's always a concern. As Allison, you spoke about, there's sticking rocks in the water, and then there's a highly engineered cross section. There's a very big difference in terms of the functionality, life, and effectiveness of that, and so that's one consideration. The second consideration is where can the county and where can funders actually expend money and resources? It has to be in places where there's a public benefit. And if it's just to stabilize a private property, they can't really participate in that, particularly because the funding agencies don't allow for such things. If there's a public benefit and a public good, they could participate in some way. So It's probably a case-by-case basis, but I would say there's some hurdles that you'd have to achieve, one of which is show me some public benefit and make sure that it's actually been done correctly. I've seen way too many rock dumps in the water where it just continues to pass through. It doesn't look different, but it is very, very different in terms of effectiveness. Hopefully that answers your question there, Jake.
So Jason, what happens when 20 residents on a block decide that this is a good idea to pursue, but there's one or two holdouts?
Good question. I think Joe can probably attest to that. What ended up happening is it depends upon your situation. So in some situations, and I'll see if I can even go back to Joe's property, not Joe's property per se. If I can slide back a few slides, sorry. It's clumsy, but it's the best way for me to explain it. Okay, so I'm going to go back one or two more. Or 5 more. All right, so this right here is one beach club, or one association, right? They all had common interest in this end parcel. Their documents, their condo documents said that every single property owner had to have check, we support it. They have a public street, and ultimately they all said check, support it. It wasn't without some discussions about the specific concerns of those individuals, because we do think that's important. But then on this one, the condo docs on this group, they all have an end parcel, but they only need a majority. So it's variable depending upon your situation. If it's individual residents and let's say there's 10 in a row and then there's one who's not interested, I think the reality is that if that's connected to something and there's logical end and a start to it, there might be some validity to that. But it's kind of, I can't say with 100% certainty what the situation will always be what the situation will be. I think it's a case-by-case issue. The other thing to acknowledge is that I think Patrick or Jim, I think you said, did we send out 3,800 or 3,900 postcards?
Just about.
It was actually 3,855.
Thank you for the
so split the difference. Yeah.
All right, that's good. That's good. Okay, so if we get a response rate that's 20 or 30%, I will be deliriously excited. That would be huge. So the reality is not dissimilar from what the situation in Euclid was. We had some people who were interested. We had a dialogue. We continued to have those dialogues, and we found out that there was more interest and support. So what we're looking for is there a pattern of support within a particular geography? If there's not, then that probably will mean we're looking elsewhere. So I think it's really about identifying where those patterns of interest are and knowing that, one or two holes here and there or whatnot, those might just be people who weren't engaged in the process or didn't respond or something like that. So I think it's inexact sciences, but it's the best way we can kind of get a feel for where people are most interested. I think in Euclid's case, they actually did a survey of all their lakefront property owners. I think that was 120-ish people, 130-ish people, Allison. Is that right? And did you have 50 response? What did you get for your response on that?
We had 132 eligible private residential homeowners, and we had 55 responses. Yeah, and that was with regards to an inquiry about setting up a shoreline special improvement district that we started that survey process. Mm-hmm.
So if we got a percentage that was anywhere near that, I might even have a drink. I mean, that would be amazing. So, it'd be a good thing. So again, I'm probably belaboring it, but the reality is it's important that we get some feedback from folks and it'll help us dictate and determine where we start investing. Jake, what else you got?
I have a couple questions here that highlight sort of the geological differences between Euclid and Lakewood and some of the other areas on the west side. Can you speak about a couple of the strategies for shoreline protection and erosion control?
I can attempt, and I'm looking for my photo here, sorry. Okay, so...
sorry, Jace, particularly in Lakewood, there's, 30 to 50-foot cliff edges.
Yeah, this is a good example here. I think this is there's Columbia Park on the top, and then this is Lakewood, Gold Coast area. I think Pier W is just to my left further, if I remember right. So this condition's very different, you're right, than even the condition or the left photo here. These Great Lakes Armor units are pretty ineffective. They typically get undercut and downcut in the front zone, and then they get overtopped, particularly during periods of high water. That continues to allow tow action of wave at the toe and ice, and that pops off pieces and chunks that eventually come off. So what we've looked at in other places where we've studied it more extensively, in Bay Village, for example, those bluffs will probably be pulled back, or in some instances just tow protection added. In this case, because of the proximity of these homes, and probably a negotiated type of thing, is I don't see the ability to lay back the bluff. And frankly, I don't know if you have to. I think what's important about this is how do you handle the tow? So it could be a revetment. It's just a stone structure that comes down at the edge here with a walkway along it. That's one solution. It could be a beach, sandy beach, or a cobble beach. That basically means that the waves stopped further out. There'd be some protective structures, probably shore parallel on that, typically shore shore parallel and not shore perpendicular. Those are much more effective. So there's, you could have a beach, you could have a revetment along the toe of it. Those are the two initial ones that come to mind. Whether that path ends up to be right against the bluff or whether it meanders a little bit, all design decisions that I can't exactly speak to at this point, but at least a couple different solutions there that I can imagine.
So what about areas where there's public access already, public or private access to the water? Are those areas that will be preserved if this plan is followed through?
Preserved and hopefully enhanced would be my response, and I guess I'll let the county make sure that they're comfortable with that. But I think Lakewood has some opportunities, and then Solstice Steps itself are a great, huge asset, right? But you kind of go to the end of this walkway and you sort of look around the corner and you think, oh, that's it. So you come up the airway and you don't have it's not a long run. I mean, it's a relatively long run, but could this be enhanced in some way, connected some way? Maybe. Cahoon Park. This might be enhanced as part of a project by the city. So yeah, I think those existing parks and facilities are intended to be preserved and expanded upon. The reality is that you got to have some connection. And I think Allison, as you spoke about, there's Sims Park on one side and then there's another public park on the other side. It made sense to make a logical connection. So I think having that public park is an asset, an opportunity that to connect and build upon it.
What about for private residences if they have access to the water now?
Well, Joe has access to it now too. It's just a little bit different. So I think there's a couple areas, and I've been up and down this entire shoreline enough to know there's a couple areas where there's boathouses and there's other things where your house is right up against there. That's a little bit tougher, right? So it's again case by case, but the intent is to allow for public access and allow for private access and manage how that public access and private access are controlled and separated. So that's the big picture idea. There's specifics on all of it because if you got a boathouse with a rails to launch from, that's a totally different game than kind of a platform that you can overlook the water from. So we'd have to probably look at it differently. But in general, the intent is to allow for those two and not make them mutually exclusive.
So Jason, you talked about federal, state, and local agencies to access grant funding. Mm-hmm. Who are these funding partners, and why would they be interested in helping?
The funding partners are everything from, and Allison can probably speak to it as well as I can, but in EUCLID it was FEMA, Federal Emergency Management. They had a parking deck that and some other improvements that were right at the top of bluff, and without it, there was a huge investment and expense that would have taken to rebuild it. But in general, there's a tremendous number of folks. Allison, you want to comment on some of those?
the FEMA funding, it was the first time that pre-disaster mitigation money at such a significant scale, which was $2.67 million, was tasked towards erosion mitigation. And it was specifically in front of the apartment buildings that, right where the cursor is, based on the density. And if we had not done something, the erosion in that area, if you remember the kind of red line before, was so significant up in that area that about 1,400 residents were going to be displaced. Other funds, we have been very fortunate to receive $14 million from Cuyahoga County Casino Revenue. We were the first community outside of the city of Cleveland to receive that funding for this public project. The majority of the funding has come from different state funds, and as Jason said before, the public benefit component of that has been critical. So whether it's a conservation grant through the Ohio Public Works Commission for the preservation of property in perpetuity for recreation, or a Clean Ohio Trail Fund specifically to provide a bicycling and pedestrian trail, there's sort of really a smattering of different opportunities you have to put together to leverage one against the other. And then in Euclid, we did also issue a $2 million bond locally in order to leverage some of those larger dollars. We've also launched a capital campaign, so there has been some private funding as well.
Those are good. Yeah, so in broad bucket terms, mobility related, so trails, access, they're looking for restoration dollars in terms of water quality enhancements or habitat enhancements are a little fuzzy. Sometimes they get approved, sometimes they don't. There's some big pots that you can get to on that. But in general, those are sort of the buckets as recreation, restoration, and sort of water quality type of zones. And just clarify, I think if we got 14 million for Euclid, that would be killer. I think it was 4, right? $4
million from the county.
Okay.
Yeah.
The county. Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say I'm totally out of my numbers when that happens. So yeah.
Unless the county wants to chip in another 10, we'll take it.
Yeah, exactly.
Build that marina.
Exactly. What else you got there, Jake?
I have a couple questions related to the security.
Yeah.
On Euclid in particular, were there cameras, and was it restricted during certain hours of the day or night?
So I'll answer part of that, and then Allison talk about it. We actually had we have poles and positions identified for cameras. They were not installed from a budgetary standpoint. We had a lot of discussion with the local police as to whether or not it was necessary. There was a lot of concern, and ultimately I'm not sure that you need that level of surveillance because I think, as Joe's indicated, places generally aren't problem places. People were using this section of shoreline, and in fact, if I go along your 30-mile shoreline right now, people are using where you don't think they're using, and they're using it in ways you don't really want. So, Allison, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Sure. Yes. So, cameras may be something that we add in the future. We had pretty extensive conversations with the Cleveland Metro Parks, who we sort of believe to be the authority on a lot of things trail related. And, on some of their trails, they have cameras, on others they don't. We believed that a combination of our auxiliary police department, as well as, just like Joe said, eyes on the trail, would do a pretty good job. And once the improvements were completely done, the distinction between private and public became way more clear, and the calls for trespassing really took a nosedive. In terms of, and this was touched on just a little bit before, so this project, the easements are with the city of Euclid, and so we have committed to maintaining the trail, which means everything from trash removal to making sure that the bluff remains in the proper vegetated condition. That was not something we wanted to, we'll say, burden the individual property owners with, and also wanting to make sure that, no one took a lawnmower to what was supposed to be a 3-foot tall vegetated bioswale, right? That we can maintain it the proper way. And so as part of that, it became part of our parks system. So all of our city parks close or are only open from dawn till dusk. So that is the same here. It is still the property of all of the lakefront property owners. So they do have the ability to, be on their property at any time of day, but it is closed to the public from dusk till dawn.
One other thing, I guess, Joe, if I could have you touch on, and it's a question that sort of comes up in general and in different ways, is value and have you seen your value of your home skyrocket or plummet as a result of this? And I'm going to guess that the answer is the same for any public trail on bike path where you actually generally see path or homes that abut it. Values actually do go up, but I'm curious what your perspective and feeling on that is, Joe.
Right away, but I think over time it will go up. Obviously, the erosion control is one thing. I mean, if you don't have erosion control today and you're on the lake, people are iffy about it, so your value is going to be lower. So the erosion control, I'm sure, will increase the value, but also the public access and the park-like quality. Like my wife and I always say, we can walk down those steps and go to the park, without getting on a public street. And those are the intangibles that I think people would realize and ultimately would raise property values.
I think there's a couple instances in our section along Euclid where people actually have invested or held on to property knowing that the value is going to go up. And so I know Randy was initially going to move, right? And last I knew from Randy, he was going to stay because he's like, oh, this is great. So I don't know. I mean, there's always perspectives on it, and whether I guess the way I'm characterizing it is that this is about stabilizing property value at this point. If it goes up, I'm not sure, because the reality is you got a liability in terms of a lot of homeowners had liabilities associated with this, and so whether that influences the ability to sell that property. I know of one property on the west side that's been sold 3 times and sits right at the top of the bluff that scares me, something fierce, when I look at how close that thing is. It's probably, the deck actually hangs out over the top, so it's kind of funny. Anyway, Jake, what else you got?
Just to follow up on that, can property owners take a tax deduction for the value of the land that they subject to the easement?
Oh, heavens to Murgatroyd. I don't know the answer to that right offhand. I'm going to ask Allison. Any ideas?
We did talk about this with some of our private property owners, including mostly the apartment owners who thought they would see a pretty significant value. Basically, told them to talk to their attorney about it. Yeah. I will say that one of the financing methods that I neglected to say before is something called a tax increment financing district, and that is something we have. We actually incorporated back in 2009 when we began planning for this project. And so in that 11 years, we've seen increased revenue to that fund, which represents an increase in property value. So, there have been some small gains, and the project won't be done until later this year. But yeah, it's sort of a case-by-case basis, and for anyone that's also been looking into the special improvement districts and what that entails, there's a whole bunch of tax implications and financing that is something that a legal counsel is much better suited to answer.
Yeah, I think one of the one point I can maybe add is that there were a couple of instances where we actually had land that was donated to the city, just in 2 areas on the far west side or far east side that were donated, and those had some implication in terms of their tax pieces. But from an easement standpoint, no, that to my knowledge didn't do much. I see a lot of questions about east and west being different. I'm totally on board with that, and that's why we had our geotech out when we were looking at the full shoreline, knowing that the bluff conditions are on the west side are totally different. And while the surface erosion is one perhaps problem, toe erosion is actually similarly the problem in both instances. Surface erosion and Euclid was an issue too. What happens even in these situations, and you can look at it over in Cahoon Park if you go down there, you can see that some portions of the cliff are inverted. It's because the toe gets wet, it freezes, it pops, and then it continues to do that game of sloughing. And so there's a whole series of slides that we have talking about that we spoke with our geotechnical engineer about, because it's not all surface stuff. It's actually toe stuff as much as anything else. And then so extending the life of the stability of those bluffs is really about that. Not to say that there aren't surface water issues too, but both actually are at play in general, whether you're west or east.
Jason, since the natural shoreline and the designation of the natural shoreline is a pretty important element here, we have a couple questions on, if you referenced 1989, the date in which the kind of a snapshot of the natural shoreline, is that an official datum? How was that set?
How was that set? It was set by an extreme number of legal cases, of which I can't quote you the case law on it, except I know how it's applied because we've permitted a ton of projects in Lake Erie. It was set by virtue of, people arguing about, well, my property extends out into the middle of the lake, and then some people said, well, no, it doesn't. And so Ohio is actually, there's a whole separate section I have from a Sea Grant presentation that illustrates and talks about that. See, in Ohio, that natural shoreline, I've never run into natural shoreline in any other state. It's a very different line. In Illinois, for example, they have the ordinary high water mark, and I can walk on a beach along the shoreline, and if I got my feet on beach, not water, I can walk along it, and I'm on public land. In Ohio, they chose, because of a number of lawsuits, extensive number of lawsuits, and if you type in natural shoreline, you Google search natural shoreline and whatnot, you'll find something that talks about public trust and that definition. So my version of it is not exactly legal language, but I can tell you it's how it's applied. There is some flexibility as to where the natural shoreline is described, in that it is a negotiation, and they allow for some back and forth on that. It's never quite as straightforward as I would want, but you basically go through aerial photography as old as, well, significantly older than me, and you look at whether there's been any change, have there been any permits, have there been any changes, and then they with a surveyor's help, and they actually define that line. It's not a simple process, but ultimately it's a negotiated sort of line, but it's basically the water line in 1989 had man not otherwise intervened. If you dump junk across there, you have unpermitted rubble fill, and it will have to be removed, and they could mandate that. And that was the case for Euclid, is that we had a number of landowners who actually said, who were in a situation where if somebody would enforce it, now, will they ever enforce it? That's a separate issue. They could technically make you remove that. The Army Corps doesn't care about it. They can't, because frankly, they manage too much stuff. The state of Ohio does. So there's a difference there. But that was a long aside for a really not a lot of gain on that answer. Sorry. But that was sort of the idea. 1989, set by case law. It's somewhat negotiable, but generally not that much. Yeah.
Thank you. There's been a few questions related to groundwater and how the quality of the groundwater may be a concern. Is there anything in this project we can do to address that?
Assume that this to mean stormwater, like
groundwater and stormwater runoff. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this question correctly, so if somebody else has a different perspective on it, or if the person who wrote that in can clarify it a little bit more for me, that'd be super awesome. The general thing is we know that there are some buried creeks, and Euclid had one of them. Roy Larrick, who's a local geologist, PhD guy, he knows them very well. He's made us very aware of them. It does influence where some of the improvements or how some of the improvements manage those flows, not just from a stormwater perspective, but from a sort of, I'm going to call it submerged or water that's in the bluff face itself. So you actually have to do some things to manage the rilling, and usually that involves dewatering in some areas, or not dewatering, but wick drains and other types of things along the shoreline. But so there's a variety. It does influence things, and you do have to have a lot of study, but it's sort of a case-by-case solution as to what exactly the problem is, and you'll go through a lot of geotechnical study to sort of analyze that, Jake.
The questions are starting to dry out a little bit. There's not as many coming in anymore.
Okay. Well, that's okay. I mean, we're actually just about at our time. I'm seeing a lot of good questions that, have been answered in one way or the other, and I'm sure not fully. But I appreciate folks taking the time to participate tonight. As I said earlier, it's not anywhere near the end of a dialogue. It is absolutely the beginning of a dialogue, and we are going to be having a number of other sessions where we actually have specific dialogue. It all starts with tonight, and we'd ask that you consider joining us on the 28th. That's a session that's going to be open for the general public, and what's important, I think Joe hit on at the onset of this, is there's a consistency that's needed in message, because we can't say one thing to somebody and say something different to somebody else. This is the openness of this process is really important. But I will say that right at this point, we would want to encourage you to continue to participate and to show up for those meetings, and continue to pester your neighbors if they haven't participated or if they haven't returned those cards. To just give us some guidance, if you would. That'd be wonderful help to us. So if there's
real quick, Jason, is that people are saying, well, what if 5 people on my street don't want it? It's going to depend on your bylaws and how they're written, what kind of majority you need. But even if in your mind you're thinking, no, this one's not going to do it, that one's not going to do it, it's way too early to say no. And like Jason said, get the word out to your neighbors, have them participate. Learn about how these projects are done, and I think you'll find the vast majority will swing to the yes side of things.
Sounds great. I appreciate everybody's time. I hope that those of you who are concerned about my interpretation of case law can correct me if you'd like, or go to the Ohio DNR's website and take a look at things. That's great. I can just tell you the experience we've had in permitting those projects. So if I'm mistaken or misunderstanding, that'd be great to understand. But I can tell you how they review the permits anyway. So, or at least have for us. So thanks so much for everybody's time tonight. Appreciate it. If you have comments, questions, enter them in the website, and we'll do our best to answer them.
And I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Jason and all of your team and County Public Works, and Allison and Joe, thank you. It's been great to hear from, a section of the pathway that's already been done, to give us some insights on those. And on behalf of all the county departments and all the partners involved in this project, I just really do want to repeat, without you in this process, it's not going to be successful. And so public engagement is a huge component of this project. And as Jason said, we're only at the beginning. Nothing has been decided, and so your input is vitally important. If we didn't get to your questions tonight, as we mentioned earlier, we will be updating the FAQ page and continue to update that information. But feel free to email us if you have more specific information that you'd like, and definitely check out the webpage. Thank you.